In this video, we'll be reviewing Part 2 of Chapter 31, American Life in the Roaring Twenties. The mass consumption economy began in the 1920s, and prosperity put the roar into the 20s. The recent war and Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon's tax policies favored rapid expansion of capital investment, new machinery, increased productivity. The assembly line production reached perfection by Henry Ford's factories, where a finished automobile emerged every 10 seconds, and new industries sprouted as a result. The automobile now became the carriage of the common citizen, and by 1930 Americans owned almost 30 million cars. This created a shift in the character of the economy. American manufacturers mastered the problems of production. They shifted their focus to consumption, and could they find mass markets for goods as well. The new arm of American commerce came into being. Advertising came into being as well, and Bruce Barton published his bestseller, The Man Nobody Knows, which had a provocative thesis that Jesus Christ was the greatest administrator or ad man of all time, saying every advertising man ought to study the parables of Jesus. It was marvelously condensed, as all good advertising should be. Christ's executive ability was quoted as being, he picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. Sports also became a big business in the consumption economy, and heroes like George Babe Ruth were far better known than most statesmen. Yankee Stadium became the house that Ruth built, and in 1921, the heavyweight champion Jack Dempsey knocked out the light heavyweight George Carpentier. The Jersey City crowd paid more than $1 million, and this was the first in a series of $1 million gates in the 1920s. This is a picture of Babe Ruth, also called the Sultan of Swat. Buying on credit was another innovation of the post-war economy. Possess today and pay tomorrow was the message. People went into debt to own all kinds of new marvels, such as refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, cars, and radios, and they wanted to own them now. Prosperity accumulated an overhanging cloud of debt, and the economy became increasingly vulnerable to disruptions of the credit structure. Machinery was the new messiah, and automobile was its principal prophet. The automobile used the new industrial system, using assembly line methods to mass produce the product. Americans adapted rather than invented the gasoline engine. Europeans claimed the original honor, and in the 1890s, daring American inventors and promoters tried to make it better. Henry Ford and Ransom E. Olds developed the first infant automobile industry. This is a picture of Henry Ford in his first car, built in 1896. By 1910, 69 car companies rolled out a total annual production of 181,000 units, and Detroit became the motor car capital of the world. Scientific management came into play as well, which was a stopwatch efficiency techniques that were created by Frederick Taylor. These eliminated wasted motion. Henry Ford, more than any other individual, put America on rubber tires. His Model T, also called the Tin Lizzie, was cheap, rugged, and reasonably reliable, though rough and clattering, and the parts were highly standardized. He devoted himself to the gospel of standardization. He grasped and applied the technique of the moving assembly line, which was called Fordism. He sold Ford Roadsters for $260, and Fordism caught fire outside the United States as well. The flood of Fords was phenomenal. In 1914, the automobile wizard turned out his 500,000th Model T, and by 1930, the total had risen to 20 million. By 1929, 26 million motor vehicles were registered, one for every 4.9 Americans. This figure shows the cost of the Model T created by Ford from 1908 to 1924. This figure shows the international comparison of the number of automobiles for the United States, France, Germany, Japan, and Britain from the period of 1900 to 1970. The impact of the self-propelled carriage was tremendous. A gigantic new industry emerged, and it employed directly or indirectly at least 6 million people. Thousands of new jobs were created by supporting industries such as rubber, glass, and fabrics, highway construction, service stations, and garages, and America's standard of living rose to an enviable level. The petroleum business was expanded as well, and oil derricks shot up in California, Texas, and Oklahoma, and railroads were hard hit by the competition with passenger cars, buses, and trucks. This is a gas station in 1923. Before that, the nation's handful of automobile owners bought fuel from their local oil companies and stored it in tanks in their own yards. Speedy marketing of the perishable foodstuffs were accelerated also, and new prosperity enriched outlying farms. Countless new hard-serviced roads were constructed, and thanks to the installment plans, countless Americans acquired the habit of riding in automobiles. The zooming motor cars were agents of social change. At first it was a luxury and rapidly became a necessity. It became a badge of freedom and equality. Ostentation seemed more important than transportation, and leisure hours could now be spent more pleasurably. Women were further freed from their dependence on men, and the suburbs spread further from the urban core. Isolation among sections declined, and autobuses made possible the consolidation of schools and to some extent churches. By 1951, 1 million Americans had died in motor vehicle accidents, and the virtuous home life was partially broken down as people abandoned their parlor for the highway. The morals of youth sagged correspondingly, and the crime wave in the 1920s and the 1930s was aided by the motor car. This is a picture called The Modern Woman in the Driver's Seat. So as part of its effort to sell to a mass market, the Ford Motor Company used advertising to convey that driving an automobile was respectable for women. A woman who drove was not only modern, but she was also better at fulfilling her traditional duties as household manager. Air and environmental quality improved with less horse use, and automobiles brought more convenience, pleasure, and excitement into more people's lives than almost any other single invention. Gasoline engines provided power that enabled humans to also achieve flight. The Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, performed the miracle at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina on December 17, 1903. Orville stayed airborne for 12 seconds and 120 feet, and the air age was launched by these two obscure Ohio bicycle repairmen. Airplanes were flying coffins, and they were used for various purposes during the Great War, 1914 to 1918, and then private companies began to operate passenger lines and transport mail. In 1927, Charles A. Lindbergh, the Flying Fool, had his first solo flight across the Atlantic. He piloted a single-engine plane called the Spirit of St. Louis from New York to Paris in a grueling 33 hours and 39 minutes. The achievement did much to dramatize and popularize flying, while giving a boost to the infant aviation industry. The impact of airship was tremendous. It provided American spirit with another dimension and gave birth to a giant new industry. This is a picture of Lucky Lindy, Charles A. Lindbergh, standing in front of the aircraft that made him famous, the Spirit of St. Louis. Unfortunately, the initial accident rate was very high. By the 1920s and 1930s, travel by air on regularly scheduled airlines was significantly safer. Humanity's new wings increased the tempo of already breathless civilization. Railroads were further hurt by the loss of passengers and mail, and this was a lethal new weapon given to war with the use of bombs. Isolation behind oceans was becoming a bygone dream as the world slowly shrank. The speed of the airplane was far eclipsed by the speed of the radio waves. And Marconi, an Italian, invented wireless telegraphs in the 1890s. These were used for long-range communication during World War I. Next came the voice-carrying radio. This was a red-letter day in November 1920 when the Pittsburgh radio station broadcast news of Harding's landslide victory. Later, miracles achieved in transatlantic wireless phonographs, radio, telephones, and television broke new ground. Earliest radio programs reached only local audiences, but by the late 1920s, technological improvements made long-distance broadcasting possible, and national commercial networks were drowning out local programming. Advertising commercials made radio another vehicle for the American free enterprise, as contrasted to the government-owned systems of Europe. Radio drew people back home and knitted the nation together. Programs were sponsored by manufacturers and distributors of brand name products and helped make radio-touted labels household words or purchases. Sports were further stimulated as a result, and politicians adjusted speaking techniques to the new medium. A host of listeners heard their favorite newscaster, and music of famous artists and orchestras beamed into countless homes. This is a picture called Family Listening In to the Radio, 1922. The flickering movie fruit of numerous geniuses began during this time period as well. In 1903 was the birth of the first story sequence on screen. It was called The Great Train Robbery. In 5-cent theaters it played, and they were popularly called Nickelodeons. The first full-length classic was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation in 1915, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction days and defamed blacks and northern carpetbaggers. Hollywood, as a result, became the movie capital of the world. This was also used in World War I as an engine of anti-German propaganda. Hang the Kaiser films helped sell war bonds and boost morale. But by 1927, the success of the first talkie, the talking movie, was The Jazz Singer. The silents were ushered out as theaters became wired for sound, and early color films were produced. There was phenomenal growth in the popularity of films. Movie stars commanded much higher salaries than the President of the United States. They were paid $100,000 for a single film, and many actors and actresses were more popular than the nation's political leaders. Critics bemoaned the vulgarization of popular tastes with films and radio. The effects of the new mass media were not all negative. The insularity of ethnic communities eroded as immigrant children took to the public media, and some diversity of immigrants' old country culture was lost, but standardization of tastes and languages hastened the entrance into the American mainstream, and it set the stage for working-class political coalitions that would overcome divisive ethnic differences of the past. This was a picture of a man in blackface, which is a way that which was part of the Jazz Singer and was a way of representing that medium. There were also changes in lifestyle and values. Changes in lifestyle and values. More lived in urban areas than in the countryside by 1920. Women continued to find employment in the cities. Organized birth control movements began, led by the fiery feminist Margaret Sanger, who openly championed contraceptives. The campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment continued by Alice Paul's National Women's Party, and churches were affected as well, with fundamentalists losing ground to modernists. Some churches tried to fight the devil with worldly weapons. This is a picture of Margaret Sanger, who was forbidden to speak about the inflammatory topic of birth control. Here she is covering her mouth and is lectured in Boston by writing on a blackboard. She promoted birth control and establishing contraceptive clinics throughout the United States. Some were also turned on to new entertainment, and some even including moving pictures for youth. Chimes struck 6 o'clock in America during this time period as advertisers exploited sexual allure to sell everything. Young women's clothing and styles changed. The flapper became symbolic of the more independent lifestyle, and the adventuresome females shocked elders when they sported new one-piece bathing suits. The justification for the new sexual frankness was found in the writings of Dr. Sigmund Freud. This is a picture called The Flapper. And a flapper is a young woman who is dressed in this fashion. This was a flamboyant way for the flapper to demonstrate their new social freedom through their dress and through their dancing. Many taboos flew out the window. Sexual freedom became more prevalent. The flapper became the goddess of an era of wonderful nonsense, and jazz became its sacred music. They moved up from New Orleans with migrating blacks. The wailing saxophone became the trumpet of a new era. People like W.C. Handy, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and Joe King Oliver gave birth to the jazz movement. This is a picture called The Guardian of Morality, where it shows a man checking the woman's new one-piece bathing suits to make sure that not too much leg was showing. There was also a new racial pride blossoming in northern black communities. In Harlem, in New York City, 130,000 African American residents in the 1920s lived there, and it was one of the largest black communities in the world. The culture was nurtured by poets like Langston Hughes, who wrote The Weary Blues in 1926. Harlem also spawned the charismatic political leader Marcus Garvey, who founded the United Negro Improvement Association to promote the resettlement of blacks in the African homeland. He also sponsored black businesses to keep money in black pockets. He helped newcomers to northern cities gain confidence and self-reliance, and the example that he provided proved important to the founding of the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslim movement. This is a picture of Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican-born founder of the United Negro Improvement Association. He advocated to protect the rights of black Americans. Basically, this is a picture of him here, giving a convention address for Negro rights. This is a picture of King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band in the early 1920s. Literature and the arts also came into play during this time period. Most of the earlier genteel writers had died off by the 1920s. New Yorker Edith Wharton and Virginia-born Willa Cather continued to be popular. Now there were new modernists becoming popular. Modernism questioned social conventions and traditional authorities and was considered outmodeled by the accelerating changes of the 20th century life. H.L. Mencken was best personified this iconoclasm. He was known as the bad boy of Baltimore. He promoted modernist causes in politics and in literature. He assailed marriage, patriotism, democracy, prohibition, Rotarians, and other sacred icons of middle-class American bourgeoisie. He dismissed the South as the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, and he attacked hypocritical do-gooders as Puritans. Puritanism, he jibed, was the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. Young writers were jolted by World War I out of the complacency about traditional values and literary standards. They were probed for new codes of morals and understanding, as well as fresh forms of expression. F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote This Side of Paradise in 1920. He found all gods dead, all wars fought, and all faiths in man shaken. He also wrote The Great Gatsby in 1925, which is a brilliant commentary on the illusory American ideal of the self-made man. And James Gatz reinvented himself as a tycoon, Jay Gatsby, only to be destroyed by those with wealth and social standing. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda. Theodore Dreiser's masterpiece, An American Tragedy, in 1925, explored the pitfalls of social striving. Ernest Hemingway was among the writers most affected by World War I. His hard-boiled realism typified post-war writing. He wrote The Sun Also Rises in 1926, which told of disillusioned, spiritually numb American expatriates in Europe. And in A Farewell to Arms in 1929, he turned his own war story into one of the finest novels about the war. His literary successes and flamboyant personal life made him one of the most famous writers in the world. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954. The Lost Generation, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and other American writers and painters formed this artistic cadre. As expatriates in the post-war Europe, they found shelter and inspiration in the Paris salon of Gertrude Stein, who studied under William James at Harvard, and her early works applied his theory of the stream of consciousness. Friends with Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, she wrote radically experimental poetry and prose, and she joined fellow American poets Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot in the vanguard of modernist literary innovation. High modernists experimented with the breakdown of traditional literary forms. They exposed losses associated with modernity. They wrote in self-consciously internationalist mode, and they haughtily rejected parochialism that they found at home. Pound rejected old civilization and proclaimed the doctrine of make it new, and he strongly influenced T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, in The Wasteland, written in 1922, produced one of the most impenetrable but influential poems of the century. and E. E. Cummings used an unorthodox diction and peculiar typesetting to produce startling poetic effects. Not all American writers were radical. Many continued the familiar regionalist style. Robert Frost wrote hauntingly about nature and folk ways of his adopted New England. Carl Sandburg extolled the working classes of Chicago in strong, simple cadence. And Sherwood Anderson in Winesburg, Ohio, dissected various fictional personalities, finding them warped by their cramped psychological surroundings. Sinclair Lewis wrote Main Street, which was a best-selling story of one woman's unsuccessful revolt against provincialism. And in Babbitt, he affectionately pilloried George Babbitt, who slavishly conforms to respectable materialism of his group. William Faulkner was focused on displacement of the agrarian Old South by the rising industrial order, and his work offered a fictional chronicle of an imaginary, history-rich Deep South country. In powerful books called The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, he peeled back layers of time and consciousness from constricted souls of his ingrown Southern characters. Faulkner experimented with multiple narrators, complex structures, and stream of consciousness techniques. His extended meditation culminated in what some consider his greatest work, which was Absalom, Absalom in 1936. American composers and playwrights made valuable contributions as well. Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein's Showboat in 1927 was America's first musical play. Eugene O'Neill's Strange Interlude laid bare the Freudian notions of sex and subconscious in the succession of dramatic soliloquies. He garnered the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1936. The Harlem Renaissance took place during this time period, and this was a black cultural renaissance in uptown Harlem. This was led by writers Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston, and jazz artists such as Louis Armstrong and Eubie Blake. They argued for the new Negro, who was a full citizen and social equal to whites. They adopted modernist techniques. Hughes and Hurston captured oral and improvisational traditions of contemporary blacks in dialect-filled poetry and prose. This is a picture called Dances at the Spring by Francis Picabo. This is the Darwin D. Martin House in Buffalo, New York, which was created by Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright is an outstanding example of the prairie style. Wall Street had a bull market during this time period also, and the economic conditions of the 1920s were that several hundred banks were failing annually, and the Florida boom caused nervous underwater plots to sell to eager purchasers for preposterous sums of money. Stocks provided an even greater sensation, and speculation ran wild. The boom or bust trading pushed the market to dizzying peaks, and the stock market became a veritable gambling den. In the 1920s, many bought stocks on margin. Intoxicated by the lure of quick profits, few heeded warnings that this kind of prosperity could not last. There was little done by Washington to curb the speculators, and in 1921, Congress moved toward budget sanity by creating the Bureau of the Budget. This assisted the president in preparing estimates of receipts and expenditures to be submitted to Congress as an annual budget. This is a picture of Langston Hughes, raised in the Midwest and arriving in New York City to attend Columbia University. He is called the Poet Laureate of Harlem. Burdensome taxes from the war were distasteful to Secretary of Treasury Mellon. He argued high taxes forced the rich to invest in tax-exempt securities rather than in factories that provided payrolls. He argued that high taxes not only discouraged business, but brought in smaller returns to the Treasury than moderate taxes. And Mellon helped engineer a series of tax reductions from 1921 to 1926. Congress repealed the excess profit tax and abolished the gift tax, and reduced excise taxes, the surtax, the income tax, and the estate tax. Mellon's spare the rich policies shifted the tax burden from the wealthy to middle-income groups. And Mellon, lionized by conservatives as the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Hamilton, remains a controversial figure. He reduced the national debt by $10 billion, but he is also accused of indirectly encouraging the bull market. This is a picture of Calvin Coolidge presiding over the jazz age. His hands-off policies in terms of banking regulation and the economy were sweet music to big business. And this is the chronology from the chapter.